My dear sister, your hair is thinning.
How much?
The candle on the vanity table had burned down to almost nothing. Its flame flickered once, twice, and then steadied itself like it refused to give up. Annalise watched it in the mirror, her fingers resting still in her lap, her spine straight, her jaw set firm. She had learned long ago not to let her hands tremble where others could see. The room smelled of rosewater and cold ash. Outside the window, London was waking up in that slow, grey way it did before a grand evening, when the sky could not decide between gold and shadow. Carriages were already rolling down the cobblestones. She could hear them. She did not look. She was not supposed to be beautiful tonight. That was not something anyone had said to her directly. No one in the Pemberton household ever said cruel things directly. They wrapped them in silk and smiled while handing them over, so that by the time you felt the cut, they were already walking away. Her name was Annalise Pemberton, or she was the second daughter, and in this family, being second meant being invisible. She reached up and touched the soft, short layer of hair at her crown. It had grown back, most of it, after the fever 2 years ago that had taken so much from her. The illness had lasted 3 weeks. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose. And when the fever finally broke, and she sat up in bed for the first time, she had looked in the small hand mirror her lady's maid had offered her, and barely recognized the face staring back. Her hair had thinned so dramatically at the top that the candlelight passed right through it, and her cheekbones had sharpened into something that felt more like grief than beauty. She had recovered. She was still recovering, in ways that had nothing to do with the body. A door opened behind her without a knock. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. She knew by the rhythm of the footsteps, light and deliberate, like someone who had practiced walking into rooms as an act of theatre. "You are not wearing that tonight." Her sister's voice filled the room, the way cold air fills a room when a window is thrown open in winter. Sudden, uninvited, impossible to ignore. Annalise met her eyes in the mirror. Genevieve Pemberton was everything the drawing rooms of London had decided a young woman should be. She had thick auburn hair that curled perfectly without effort, a complexion that painters had once tried and failed to capture, and a smile that she wore like a weapon she had never once had to sharpen, because it had always been sharp enough. She was the eldest daughter. She was the one who mattered. Tonight she wore a gown of deep gold silk that made her look like she had been poured out of a sunset. The jewels at her throat were their mother's. Anelise had not been offered them. "Why, I was not aware," Annalise said carefully, "that my choice of dress required your approval." Genevieve tilted her head. There it was, that small, practiced tilt, the one that said she found something amusing that was not actually amusing to her at all. "It does not require my approval. I am simply telling you, as a kindness, that you will embarrass the family." Annalise looked down at her own gown. It was ivory, with a pale champagne sash and small pearl buttons along the sleeve. It was not the most fashionable cut. It was not trimmed with lace imported from the continent. But it was clean, and it was pressed, and it had been chosen with care. "I think it is perfectly appropriate," she said. "You would?" Genevieve stepped fully into the room, and let her gaze move slowly over Annalise, the way one might examine something one was considering throwing away. You always think that about yourself, don't you? That you are perfectly appropriate, that you are enough, honestly. What Annalise, standing next to you, is not difficult at all. The candle flame dipped. Annalise kept her eyes forward. The Ashford ball is not a place for wallflowers, Genevieve continued, moving toward the vanity and lifting one of Annalise's small perfume bottles, turning it over in her fingers with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been told not to touch things that were not hers. The Duke of Cavendish will be there tonight. Every eligible woman in London will be presenting herself. And you, she set the bottle down, not gently. You will be standing in a corner with that look on your face, the one that makes people feel slightly sorry for you, and then slightly relieved they are not you. I was not aware I had such a look, Annalise said. Her voice was very steady. She was proud of that. She had worked hard on that steadiness. You have had it since the fever. Genevieve's eyes moved briefly to the top of Annalise's head. It was a quick look, almost nothing. But Annalise caught it in the mirror and felt it like a hand pressed flat against an old wound. You came back from that illness looking. Genevieve paused, as if choosing her words not out of kindness, but out of performance, out of a desire to appear as if she had hesitated, diminished. I do not say this to be cruel. I say it because someone ought to say it. But your hair is still thin at the top. You are still too pale. And whatever light you used to carry, before all of that, well, it has not entirely returned. The room was very quiet. Annalise thought of the candle. She thought of how it had flickered and refused to go out. "Thank you," she said, "for your concern." Genevieve laughed, soft and dismissive. "You are going to sit in that corner and watch me be courted by the most sought-after man in England, and you are going to pretend you are content. You have always been very good at pretending." She moved toward the door, gold silk rustling, the scent of her expensive perfume trailing behind her, like a quiet declaration of victory. At the threshold she paused. She always paused at thresholds. Everything Genevieve did was arranged for effect. "Bald and worthless," she said, almost lightly, almost as if she were commenting on the weather. "That is what Lady Forsyth's daughter called you last season. I did not correct her. I thought you should know that." The door closed. Annalise sat very still for a long time. Then she picked up her small hairbrush and drew it through her hair, slowly, carefully, the way she did every single night. She watched herself in the mirror, and she did not cry. Not because she did not feel the sting of it, not because the words had not found the exact, tender place they had been aimed at, but because she had promised herself, 2 years ago in a sick bed when she had not been sure she would survive to see another winter, that she would not waste her tears on people who did not deserve the salt of them. She pinned her hair up with the pearl-tipped pins she had saved for tonight. She smoothed the ivory gown over her waist. She pressed her lips together and then released them. She stood. She was going to the Ashford ball, not to stand in a corner, not to be overlooked, or not to watch her sister collect admiration like a woman collecting flowers she would only leave to wilt. She did not know yet why she felt something different tonight. She could not have named it if someone had asked. It was not confidence exactly. It was quieter than that, and more stubborn. It was the feeling of someone who has been told repeatedly that a door is locked and has decided, for no reason other than sheer tired refusal, to try the handle one more time, though the Pemberton carriage smelled of old leather and her mother's nerves. Lady Pemberton sat across from both her daughters with her hands folded and her eyes moving between them in a constant, anxious calculation. She was a woman who had married well and spent 20 years terrified of falling. She loved her daughters in the way a person loves things they have built their survival around, urgently and with a great deal of pressure. "Genevieve," she said, adjusting her daughter's already perfect wrap, "you must be careful not to appear too eager with the Duke. Eagerness reads as desperation in a ballroom. You must be warm but slightly distant, interested but not invested." Genevieve nodded with the serene patience of someone who had heard all of this before and was already 10 steps ahead. Lady Pemberton's eyes moved to Anelise. They moved over her the way they always did, with a kind of wearied assessment, as though every time she looked at her younger daughter, she was recalculating a sum that kept coming out wrong. "You look fine," she said. It was not a compliment. It was an absence of complaint. Annalise looked out the carriage window. The streets of London were golden tonight. Every lamp was lit, it seemed, every window bright. The city was dressed for something, and so was she, even if no one in this carriage noticed it. While she pressed one gloved finger against the cold glass and thought about nothing in particular. She thought about the fever and the mirror and the hairbrush. She thought about Lady Forsyth's daughter, and about Genevieve's voice, light and careless as she delivered the words, bald and worthless, the way someone tosses bread to ducks, without real thought, without real aim, just to watch the effect of the throwing. She thought about the Duke of Cavendish. She had never met him, or she knew what everyone knew, that he was the most eligible man in England, that he had a title so old it predated half the buildings in London, that he was tall and cold and brilliant, and that he had not attended a ball in 2 full seasons, because he had been abroad on business of some kind that people speculated about endlessly without ever arriving at the truth. She knew that his return to society this season had sent the drawing rooms of Mayfair into a very particular kind of fever, and that every mother with a daughter of marriageable age had circled tonight's Ashford ball on their calendar with the energy of a woman who believes the tide is finally turning. She did not feel that fever herself. She was not angling for a duke. She was not angling for anyone. She simply wanted, for one evening, to walk into a room and not disappear. The Ashford house was lit from top to bottom, every window blazing, or the front steps flanked by footmen in livery who held lanterns against the growing dark. The sound of music drifted out even before the carriage door opened, strings and laughter and the low hum of 100 conversations layered over each other. Annalise stepped down from the carriage behind her mother and her sister. She smoothed her gown one final time. She lifted her chin. Above the Ashford house, the sky had finally decided. It was gold after all, a deep and burning gold, that shot through with the last thin edge of the setting sun. She stepped forward and into the light. The grand foyer was everything she expected, and more than she had allowed herself to anticipate. Tall ceilings with plasterwork so fine it looked carved by someone who had loved the work. Mirrors along the walls throwing the candlelight back at itself until the room seemed to glow from the inside. Women in gowns of every colour moved through the space like petals caught in a slow current, and the gentlemen among them were stiff with the particular energy of men who have been told this evening matters and are doing their best to look as though it does not. Genevieve stepped ahead immediately, drawn toward a cluster of young women she knew, her laughter rising before she had even fully crossed the threshold. Lady Pemberton followed, her eyes already searching the room in that quick, efficient way she had. Anelise stood for a moment near the entrance. Just one moment. She breathed in the smell of beeswax candles and cut flowers and the faint sweetness of something warm from the kitchens, and she let the music settle into her bones, and she thought that whatever else this evening held, at least it held this: the feeling of being present, the feeling of being here. She moved into the room. She did not yet know that she was already being watched. She did not yet know that across the full sweep of that glittering ballroom, from the far end near the tall windows that looked out over the garden, a pair of dark eyes had found her the moment she walked through the door, and had not looked away since. She did not know that the Duke of Cavendish, who had not attended a ball in 2 full seasons, who had stood for the past quarter hour near those windows with a glass of wine he had not touched, and an expression that several nervous hostesses had already described as forbidding, had gone very still the moment she entered. She did not know any of this yet. She only knew that the candle in her had flickered, and tonight she decided it would not go out. The ballroom of Ashford House was the kind of room that reminded people of their place, not cruelly, not with any intention, but simply by existing so grandly that everyone inside it felt, at least briefly, the particular smallness of being human in a space built to impress. The ceiling soared, the chandeliers dripped with crystal that caught the candlelight and scattered it in 1,000 directions at once. The musicians in the gallery above played with the smooth or unhurried confidence of people who knew that the evening belonged to them as much as to anyone below. Annalise moved through it carefully. She was not timid. That was something people misunderstood about her, people who saw her quietness and mistook it for fear. She was not afraid of ballrooms or crowds or the sharp, assessing eyes of society women who had been trained since girlhood to notice everything and forget nothing. She had grown up in this world. She understood its rhythms. She simply chose not to perform for it. And that choice, she had learned, was the one thing this world found most difficult to forgive. She accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing footman and found a space near one of the tall columns that lined the edge of the dance floor, not hiding, observing. There was a difference, though she knew that most people who saw her standing alone would not bother to find it. The dancing had begun. 3 couples moved in the opening figures of a country dance, of their steps bright and deliberate, their faces carrying that particular expression of people who are enjoying themselves and also very aware that they are being watched, enjoying themselves. She recognized 2 of the women. She nodded when their eyes passed over her. Their eyes passed over her and kept moving. She was used to that. Across the room, Genevieve had already positioned herself near the most visible corner of the space, where the light fell best, and the traffic of guests was heaviest. She was laughing at something a young lord was saying, her head tilted just so, her auburn curls catching every flicker of the chandelier above. She looked like a painting of a woman at a ball, composed and luminous, and precisely where she intended to be. Annalise watched her for only a moment before looking away. It was not jealousy she felt. She had turned that feeling over so many times in the quiet of her own room, examined it from every angle, and always arrived at the same conclusion. But it was not jealousy. It was grief, or a smaller and more private thing, the grief of someone who had once believed that love between sisters was unconditional and had been corrected on that belief slowly, repeatedly, and without apology. She took a sip of lemonade and let her gaze travel the room. That was when she saw him. Or rather, that was when she became aware that she had been seeing him for several minutes without fully registering it, of the way you sometimes hear a sound in a quiet house before you consciously identify it as a sound at all. He had been at the edge of her vision since she moved to the column, a tall stillness in a room full of motion, and now that she looked directly, she understood why something in her had noticed him before her mind caught up. He was not like the other men in the room. It was not only his height, though he was tall enough that she could see him clearly over the heads of several guests between them. It was not the quality of his coat, though it was plainly excellent. It was the quality of his attention. Every other man in the ballroom was performing some version of himself, talking too loudly or laughing too readily, or wearing the carefully arranged expression of someone who wanted to be found attractive and was working toward it. This man was doing none of those things. He was simply standing near the windows at the far end of the room, a glass in one hand that he had clearly forgotten about, and he was watching. His face was difficult to read from this distance. She could see the strong line of his jaw, the dark hair brushed back from his forehead, the way his eyes were steady and direct and trained at this precise moment on something across the room. She followed the line of his gaze out of simple, idle curiosity. It took her a moment to realize that it ended at her. She looked back at him quickly, her pulse doing something inconvenient, and found that yes, he was looking at her. Not past her, not in her general direction, but at her, with an expression she could not name from across a crowded ballroom, and was not sure she would have been able to name from close range either. She did what any sensible woman would do. She looked away. She looked at the dancers. She looked at her lemonade. She looked at a large arrangement of white roses near the entrance, and thought about how they must have cost a considerable amount, and how Lord Ashford must have a very devoted head gardener, or a very anxious wife. She did not look back across the room. She was almost proud of herself for this. Then Genevieve appeared at her side. She had not heard her coming. Genevieve moved through rooms the way warm weather moves. You did not notice its arrival until you were already inside it. She settled beside Anelise with a smile perfectly arranged for the benefit of anyone watching, which meant it carried no warmth whatsoever for the person it was aimed at. "You are standing at the column again," Genevieve said sweetly. "I am. You have been standing there since we arrived." She let her gaze move over Annalise slowly, from the pearl pins in her hair, down to the ivory hem of her gown, and the thoroughness of it was itself a kind of commentary. "You know who is in this room tonight?" "I am aware of the guest list, yes." "Then you understand," Genevieve said, lowering her voice to something intimate and sharp, "that you ought not to draw attention to yourself. A woman standing alone at a column is either mysterious or pitiable, and I think we both know which one applies in your case." Annalise did not respond to that, or Genevieve tilted her head and looked at her with the expression she wore when she was about to say something she had been waiting to say for some time. "Your hair, Annalise. What about it?" "The pins are doing their best." She said it gently, the way a surgeon might say something gentle before pressing on the wound. But from this angle, near the candlelight, one can see quite clearly that the top is still thin. It still looks. She paused. Letting the pause do the work she pretended she did not want done. It still looks bald, honestly. It is the first thing anyone notices when they look at you. The word landed in the space between them and sat there. Bald. Said directly. Said clearly. Wrapped in nothing at all. Annalise felt the heat of it move through her chest, and then she felt something else follow immediately behind it. Not anger, not tears, but something quieter and more resilient than either. The same stubborn, but refusing quality she had found in herself 2 years ago, in a sickbed when the fever was high and recovery was not guaranteed, and she had decided, without drama, simply as a matter of fact, that she was going to be all right. "Thank you," she said, in a voice so composed it almost surprised her. "For the observation." Genevieve studied her for a moment, looking for the crack, for the wobble, for the place where the words had gone in. What when she did not find one, she adjusted her smile and lifted her chin. "I am only being honest. Someone must be." She smoothed the front of her gold gown with one hand. "The Duke of Cavendish is near the windows. Every woman in this room with any real prospect is preparing to make herself known to him. I would not waste your energy. Men like that do not look at women like you, Annalise. They simply do not." She patted her arm once, twice, the way you pat something you are finished with. "And stay here in your column. It suits you." She moved away, back into the bright, golden center of the room, and the crowd accepted her immediately, parting and then closing around her like water. Annalise stood at her column. She pressed her fingertips together inside her gloves and breathed slowly and looked at the dance floor and let the music fill up the space where the words still echoed. Then she set her empty glass on a nearby tray, smoothed the front of her ivory gown, and decided something. She was going to walk through this room, not to prove anything to Genevieve, who was already occupied with the young lord and would not notice. Not to satisfy her mother, who was somewhere nearby, performing her own calculations. She was going to walk through this room because she had come here tonight, and she was still here, and the evening was not over, and she was not, despite everything that had been said to her today, finished. She moved along the edge of the dance floor, her pace unhurried. The music had shifted into something slower, a waltz, and the couples on the floor rearranged themselves with the practiced ease of people who had decided, before arriving, who they would dance with. She passed a knot of older women deep in a scandal she did not know the details of. She passed 2 young men arguing quietly about horses. She passed a girl she had known at school, who smiled warmly and was then swept away by a partner before either of them could speak. She was halfway around the room when she became aware that the quality of the air ahead of her had changed. It was a strange thing to notice. She noticed it anyway. The crowd thinned near the tall windows, and the gold evening light had deepened now into something richer and darker, the last color of the day pressing against the glass from outside. Or she was perhaps 10 steps from the windows when she understood that she had been walking, without entirely meaning to, toward the spot where the man with the grey eyes was still standing. She slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. She looked at the window instead, at the garden beyond, where the last of the sunset was painting the gravel paths, amber and the hedges dark. "The roses are better in the west garden," said a voice beside her. It was a low voice, quiet, but with a quality of carrying, not the kind of voice that did not need to rise to be heard. She turned and found herself looking at a white cravat, and then lifting her gaze at the face she had been observing from across the room. He was closer than distance had allowed her to properly see. The jaw she had observed was strong, and there was a seriousness to the set of his mouth that was not unkindness. It was more like someone who had grown accustomed to choosing his words carefully, because careless ones had caused damage somewhere in his past. His eyes were dark grey, not the black they had appeared from across the room, and they were looking at her with that same direct and considered attention that had caught her notice in the first place. "I beg your pardon," she said. "In the Ashford garden," he said. "The roses on this side are cut flowers arranged this morning, but in the west garden there are climbing roses that have been growing along the stone wall for 30 years. They are not arranged, they are simply there." He paused. "They are considerably better." She looked at him for a moment. "Have you visited the garden this evening?" "Before the guests arrived. I find ballrooms considerably more manageable when I have first established where the exits are." It was such an unexpected thing to say that she nearly smiled. She caught it just in time. "That is a very practical approach to a social occasion. I am a very practical man." She was aware, at the edges of her attention, that people nearby had noticed this exchange. She could feel the slight shifting of bodies, the redirected glances, the sudden attentiveness of conversations that had been pointed elsewhere a moment ago. She did not look around to confirm it. She kept her eyes on him. "I do not believe we have been introduced," she said. "We have not." He inclined his head. "Benedict Ashworth, Duke of Cavendish." She absorbed this without visible reaction, which she felt was one of the finer achievements of her evening so far. "Annalise Pemberton, Miss Pemberton." He said her name as though testing the weight of it. "You were standing near that column for some time." "I was." "You did not look uncomfortable." "I was not uncomfortable." "Most people," he said, and something shifted very slightly in his expression, not quite warmth, but the place directly adjacent to it, "who stand alone at events like this spend a great deal of energy appearing as though they mean to be standing alone, as though it is a choice they are confident about. You simply stood there." She looked at him directly. "It was a choice I was confident about." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly conversational, and then, almost against his own apparent intentions, the corner of his mouth moved. It was barely a smile. It was the suggestion of one. It was the most restrained, and somehow the most genuine expression she had seen on any face in this entire ballroom. "Miss Pemberton," he said, setting his still untouched glass of wine on the windowsill and turning to face her more fully. "Would you do me the honor of the next dance?" The music was still waltzing. The floor was full of couples. Across the room, though she did not look, and she was somehow certain that her mother had gone very still, and that Genevieve had not yet looked up from Lord Fenwick, and did not yet know what was happening near the west windows. She thought of the candle on the vanity table. She thought of the word bald said directly, with a smile, in a room that smelled of rose water. She thought of 2 years of recovering, slowly and stubbornly, in a body that had frightened her, and a house that had never entirely felt like home. Yes, she said, I would. The moment she stepped onto the floor with him, the room changed. She felt it before she saw it, a shift in the texture of the air, the way sound behaves differently in a space where everyone has suddenly decided to pay attention. The waltz continued. The musicians did not miss a note, but beneath the music, the usual hum of the ballroom dropped, caught itself, and became something quieter and more pointed. People were watching. She had always been very good at knowing when she was being watched. To years of practice in rooms where watching was the primary activity, and she knew it now with complete certainty. She kept her eyes on Benedict Ashworth and stepped into the opening position of the waltz. He danced the way he stood, with an economy of movement that suggested total control. Not stiff, not mechanical, but precise in the way that things are precise when they have been considered. His hand rested at her waist with a pressure that was correct and careful, and somehow, despite its correctness, entirely distracting. She rested her own hand on his shoulder and felt the solidity of him, the absolute unhurried steadiness, and thought that this was what it must feel like to stand next to something that would not move regardless of what pressed against it. You dance well, he said, after the first few bars had carried them through the opening turn. You sound surprised, she said. I am not surprised. I am confirming something I suspected. She tilted her head slightly. What did you suspect? That you do most things with more attention than people give you credit for. He guided her through a turn without effort, his timing exact. You watched the room for a long time before you moved through it. You chose your path deliberately. You listened to conversations without entering them. These are not the habits of someone who drifts. She studied his face. But you observed me quite closely for someone attending to his own affairs. I was not attending to my own affairs, he said, with a candor so free of apology that it arrived almost as a shock. I had finished attending to my own affairs some time before you arrived. After that, I was simply waiting to see if the evening would produce anything worth the candle. And did it? He looked at her steadily. You walked in. It was not a flattering declaration. It was not the kind of thing a practiced charmer said, wrapped in flourish and designed for effect. It was a plain sentence delivered plainly, and perhaps for that reason it did more damage to her composure than any polished compliment could have managed. She felt it somewhere behind her sternum, a small and inconvenient warmth, and she took care to keep it entirely off her face. You do not know me at all, she said. No, he agreed, but that is rather the point of the dance. They moved through the next sequence in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. That was a strange thing. She had stood through dozens of dances in her life, and the silence in them had always felt like something to be filled, an obligation, a gap that politeness required you to bridge. This silence felt different. It felt like a room where two people were separately thinking, and neither felt the need to pretend otherwise. You have been abroad, she said eventually. 2 years. People here have a great many theories about why. One corner of his mouth shifted. I am aware. I have heard 3 of them tonight already. A diplomatic mission, a broken engagement, A duel with a French count. Were any of them correct? One was partially correct, he said. I will leave you to determine which. She considered him. The grey eyes were steady on hers, and there was something in them that she was beginning to recognize, a quality of attention that did not waver, did not drift toward the more interesting or more beautiful or more socially significant thing in the room, but remained, with a kind of deliberate patience, exactly where it had placed itself. She was not accustomed to being looked at this way. She was accustomed to being looked past, or looked at briefly, assessed, and found either adequately placed or slightly wanting, depending on the day and the company. And she was accustomed to the glance that moved on. This did not move on, and she did not entirely know what to do with that, so she kept talking because talking was manageable. "Why have you returned this season?" she asked. "A title carries obligations," he said. "I have deferred them long enough." "Marriage obligations?" she said. "Among others." He paused. "You are very direct." "You seem to prefer it." "I do," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth moved a little more than before, but I find it remarkable how rarely I encounter it. The waltz was winding toward its conclusion. She could feel it in the music, the way the melody began to gather itself, pulling the long threads of the piece toward an ending. In another minute, the dance would be over, and this small, strange, weightless space between them would close, and she would step back into the ordinary geometry of the ballroom, and he would be the Duke of Cavendish again, and she would be the second Pemberton daughter, with the thin hair and the ivory gown, and the word bald still sitting somewhere in her chest, like a stone she had not yet decided where to put. She found, unexpectedly, that she did not want the dance to end. She noted this feeling with some alarm, and filed it away to examine later, in the privacy of her own room, where she could take it out and look at it without consequence. "Miss Pemberton," he said, as the music softened toward its final notes. "Your family is here tonight. Your mother and your sister, I believe." "Yes. Your sister is Miss Genevieve Pemberton." Something shifted in her chest. Not quite painful. The anticipation of it. "She is." He said nothing for a moment. His face gave nothing away, but she noticed, she was very good at noticing, that the set of his jaw tightened just slightly, and that his eyes, which had not moved from her face, became for just a second more careful, more deliberate, as though he was choosing what came next with considerable precision. "I met her once," he said, "2 seasons ago, before I went abroad." "She makes a considerable impression," Annalise said. Her voice was perfectly level. "She does," he said. Then, after a pause so brief she might have imagined it, "She is not what I am looking for." The music stopped. Around them, couples separated and turned toward each other in little bows and curtsies, and the applause that followed a waltz began, light and polite, scattering across the room like rain on a window. Annalise stepped back and curtsied, her eyes down for one moment, just one, because she needed that moment to put her face back in order before she raised it again. When she did, he was still looking at her. He bowed, correct and unhurried. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Pemberton." "Thank you, Your Grace." He held her gaze for 1 second longer than the formality required. Then he turned, and the crowd shifted around him as he moved. the way crowds always shifted around men who carried a certain kind of weight in a room, the small unconscious parting, the brief stilling of bodies, the attention that followed without quite being given. She stood where she was for a moment. Then she walked, slowly and quite calmly, back towards the column where she had begun the evening. And she stood in its shade, and she breathed once, carefully, and she thought about what he had just said. She is not what I am looking for. She turned the words over. She looked at them from different angles. She told herself, firmly and reasonably, that they meant nothing in particular, that they were the casual observation of a man making polite conversation, that she should not be constructing anything from them, not the smallest or most provisional structure. As she was not entirely convincing herself, Genevieve found her 9 minutes later. She appeared beside her with a smile so bright and so perfectly constructed that anyone looking at them would have seen two sisters sharing a warm and close moment. She was very good at that, at wrapping things in the appearance of warmth while delivering something else entirely underneath it. "You danced with him," Genevieve said. Not an accusation, an observation made in the precise tone of one. "I did. The Duke of Cavendish." Her voice was very smooth, the way water is smooth before it begins to move fast. "You danced the waltz with the Duke of Cavendish." "He asked me," Annalise said simply. A silence, brief and loaded. "He asked you?" "Yes." Genevieve's smile did not falter. This was one of her gifts, the smile that stayed in place regardless of what was happening behind it. "How very unexpected. Or you must have been standing conveniently nearby when he had no better option in view." "I was near the windows. We spoke briefly. He asked me to dance." Annalise kept her voice light. "It was a pleasant waltz." "He has not danced with anyone else tonight," Genevieve said. The smoothness in her voice had acquired a very faint edge, almost inaudible, like a seam in fabric you only find when the light falls exactly right. "Not a single woman in this room. And yet he chose you." She said the word "you," the way one says a word one finds slightly implausible. Annalise said nothing. Genevieve turned to face her more fully, lowering her voice so the conversation remained entirely private inside the larger noise of the room. "Annalise, I told you earlier what I thought of your hair. I told you because someone had to." Her eyes moved, brief and deliberate, to the top of Annalise's head. Standing under the chandelier only makes it more visible, of the thinness, the way the light goes straight through. I said the word and I meant it. You still look bald up there, and men like Benedict Ashworth notice these things whether they say so or not. She tilted her head gently, the way she always did when she wanted cruelty to wear the costume of concern. Whatever he said to you on that floor, whatever small attention he paid, do not let it mean more than it does. He was being gracious. Men of his position are trained to be gracious to women who need it. Annalise was quiet for a moment. She thought about the grey eyes that had not moved from her face for the entire length of the waltz. She thought about the voice that had said, "You walked in without flourish and without apology." She thought about a man who had stood alone near a window for an hour in a room full of the most beautiful and eligible women in London, and had waited, apparently, for something else. "Or you may be right," she said pleasantly. Genevieve studied her for a moment, searching, then gave a small and satisfied nod and turned back toward the glittering room. "Mother is signalling me. Lord Fenwick wants a second dance, and I need to handle that carefully." She moved away smoothly, gold silk catching the light, the room tilting gently in her direction, as it always did. Annalise stayed where she was. She did not feel what Genevieve had intended her to feel. That was the thing she was slowly understanding about herself, the thing the fever had perhaps burned into her, along with everything else it had taken. She was harder to extinguish now than she used to be. The words still stung. They would always sting. But beneath the sting, something quiet and certain was holding its ground. She looked across the ballroom. Through the moving, glittering crowd, she found him without difficulty, as though her eyes had quietly memorized the coordinates of where he stood. He was speaking with Lord Ashford now, his head inclined, his expression attentive and contained. And then, as though he felt the weight of her attention across all that crowded space, he looked up and found her immediately. Then he looked away. Annalise pressed her gloved fingers together at her sides and looked at the dancing couples and told herself, again, firmly and with great reasonableness, not to make anything of it. She was becoming considerably less convincing with every passing minute. The supper room at Ashford House was smaller than the ballroom, but no less carefully arranged. Round tables dressed in white linen held silver candelabras and small posies of cream roses, and the food was laid out along the far wall with the precision of a military campaign, every dish in its exact place, every server standing at attention behind it. Oh, the room smelled of warm bread and melted butter, and something sweet from the dessert end of the table that Annalise could not immediately identify, but that made her feel, briefly and unexpectedly, like a child again, before the fever, before the years of being second, before all of it. She had come in alone. Her mother had been swept into conversation with Lady Ashford near the entrance, and had gestured vaguely at Annalise in a way that meant finding somewhere to sit and not embarrass me. Genevieve had entered on the arm of Lord Fenwick, who was looking at her with the devoted expression of a man who understood he was in over his head and had decided to enjoy it anyway. They had moved immediately to the most visible table, nearest the center of the room, where the candlelight was best, and the audience largest. Annalise took a plate and moved quietly along the supper table, serving herself without hurry. She chose what she actually wanted, were cold roasted chicken and soft white bread, and a small dish of something with cream and preserved cherries that turned out to be exactly as good as it smelled. She was not performing appetite or restraint for anyone's benefit tonight. She was hungry, and the food was good, and she was going to eat it. She found a seat at a smaller table near the window, slightly to the side of the main activity, where the candlelight was softer, and the noise of the room reached her as a pleasant hum rather than a pressure. Two older gentlemen were already seated there, deep in a conversation about land enclosures that they did not pause or adjust for her arrival, which she found entirely agreeable. She sat, unfolded her napkin, and began to eat. She had been seated for perhaps 4 minutes when the chair across from her was drawn back and someone sat down. She looked up. Benedict Ashworth set his own plate on the table with the calm of a man who had made a decision and saw no reason to explain it. He had a modest supper in front of him, bread, meat, nothing elaborate, and he settled into the chair the way he did everything, without unnecessary movement, as though he had always intended to be exactly here. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Pemberton." He picked up his fork. "You chose the cherries." She glanced at her dish. what I did. They are the best thing on the table. Most people pass them by because the dish is small and placed near the end, and they have already filled their plates before they reach it. He looked at his own plate, which contained no cherries. I arrived too late. She considered him for a moment. Then she picked up the small serving spoon, reached across the modest width of the table, and transferred a portion of cherries to the empty space at the edge of his plate. He looked at the cherries. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, something so small it was barely visible, but she was beginning to learn the geography of that face, its restraint and its precision, and she saw it. "Thank you," he said. "You identified them correctly," she said. It seemed only fair. They ate in a companionable silence for a moment. The two older gentlemen beside them continued their conversation about land enclosures, without any awareness that the most sought-after man in England had just sat down at their table and was eating cherries he had been given by the second Pemberton daughter. "You chose this table deliberately," she said. "It was not a question. I did. There are 14 other tables in this room. I am aware." She looked at him steadily, though several of them have considerably more prominent guests at them. "Yes," he said. He tried one of the cherries and was quiet for a moment, in the way people are quiet when something is better than expected. Then he looked at her. "I did not come to this supper room for prominent guests." The warmth behind her sternum was back. She addressed herself to her bread and told it firmly to stop. "You are going to cause a great deal of conversation," she said. "I cause conversation regardless of where I sit. I have learned to find it less interesting than the conversation at my own table." She looked at him again. There was something about the way he said things, the plainness of them, the absence of decoration that kept catching her off guard. She was used to men in ballrooms who spoke in performances, who constructed sentences for effect, who said things designed to be repeated later and admired. He simply said what was true. It was a quality so uncommon in the rooms she moved through that she kept bumping into it, as though it were a piece of furniture rearranged in a familiar space. "May I ask you something?" she said. "You may ask me anything." "Why did you stay abroad for 2 years? You said one of the theories was partially correct. I have been considering the options, and I think it was a broken engagement." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window behind him, the garden was fully dark now, at the last of the evening light gone, and the candles on the table between them made the space feel smaller and more private than it actually was. "It was not a broken engagement," he said. "It was an engagement I ended before it was formalized, before any announcement. Before, technically, it existed in the eyes of society." He paused. "But it existed in my own understanding of things, and ending it required a period of distance." She was quiet, or giving him the space to continue or not, as he chose. "She was not a bad person," he said, and the care with which he said it told her that he had thought about this for a long time, and arrived at that conclusion through effort rather than ease. "She was charming and accomplished and everything that a match of that kind is supposed to be. But there was something missing that I could not name at the time, and can name now only as this. When I was with her, I always felt that we were both performing for the same audience, and that neither of us was certain who the audience was." Annalise set down her fork gently. "And you didn't want that?" "I didn't want that," he said. I wanted something real. I was not certain it existed in the circles I moved through. I went abroad to conduct business, and I found, over 2 years, that I was in no particular hurry to return. He looked at her directly. Until this season, I had no reason that felt sufficient. The candle between them flickered in a small draught from somewhere, and then straightened. Annalise looked at it and thought about her own candle at the vanity table that morning, burning down to almost nothing and refusing to go out. That is a very honest account, she said. I told you. I prefer directness. He picked up his wine glass. But you haven't asked me why I sat down at this table. You told me why. I told you it was not for prominent guests. That is an incomplete answer. She met his eyes. Then give me the complete one. He looked at her steadily, the grey eyes very clear in the candlelight, and said, Because I watched you walk into a room tonight and stand in it as though you belonged there completely, without performance, without apology, without looking around to see if anyone was confirming it for you. And because in 26 years of attending events like this one, I have never once seen anyone do that, and because I wanted to know who you were. The supper room continued around them. Forks clinked on china. Someone laughed at a nearby table. The servers moved silently along the wall. The world proceeded exactly as it had before. Annalise felt as though something had shifted, quietly and irreversibly, in the way a room shifts when a window is opened, when air that has been still for a long time begins to move. She thought about what Genevieve had said. Men of his position are trained to be gracious to women who need it. She looked at the face across the table from her, the seriousness of it, the steadiness of it, the complete absence of the social performance she had been watching all evening in everyone else. This was not graciousness. This was not charity. She did not know exactly what it was yet, but she knew that with a certainty she could feel in her bones, the way you feel weather changing, that it was not that. You are going to complicate my evening considerably, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. I have been told I complicate things. I imagine you have. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his plate, and then he looked up again. Miss Pemberton, your sister spoke to you earlier, before the waltz. She went still. Did she? I was near enough to observe the exchange, but I could not hear the words. But I saw your face. He said it carefully, without pity, without softness of the condescending kind, simply as a man reporting what he had seen. And I saw your face during the dance as well, and it was entirely different. I want you to know that I noticed the difference. She was quiet for a long moment. My sister, she said at last, has always known exactly where to aim. Yes, he said. I noticed that about her 2 seasons ago. She looked at him. Or what did she do 2 seasons ago? He was quiet for just a breath. She told me something about a young woman I had shown interest in at a dinner party. Something designed to redirect my attention. Something that later turned out to be considerably less true than it had been presented. Annalise absorbed this slowly, turning it over, fitting it against what she knew of her sister's particular talents. Who was the young woman? He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read. And then quietly, he said, I believe you knew her, Miss Harriet Langdon. She left London shortly after and married a man in Bath. Annalise remembered Harriet Langdon, warm and clever and a little shy, with brown hair and kind eyes, and a laugh that seemed to surprise even herself. She had wondered at the time why Harriet had left so suddenly. She had written twice and received a brief and distant reply, and then nothing. She understood now, or she looked down at her plate and then back up at him. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know." "It was not your doing," he said. Then, after a pause, "I came back to London this season without any particular expectation. I had not anticipated." He stopped, and for the first time, she saw something in his face that was not entirely composed, a brief and unguarded moment, quickly recovered. "I hadn't anticipated this evening." They sat with that for a moment. Of the two of them, and the candle and the cherries, and the quiet, ordinary miracle of two people recognizing something in each other that neither had expected to find. Then, Lady Pemberton descended. She arrived at the table with the energy of a woman who has been watching a situation develop from across a room and has decided, after considerable internal debate, to intervene. Her eyes moved from Annalise to the Duke and back with the speed of someone doing very fast arithmetic. "But your Grace," she said, with a curtsy that was slightly too deep for the informality of a supper room. "What a delight! I am Lady Pemberton. I see you have found my daughter." "I have," he said, rising from his chair with impeccable courtesy. She was kind enough to share the cherries. Lady Pemberton looked at the dish, at the cherries, at her daughter, and visibly decided this was not the point. "We are so pleased you are returning to London this season, while your presence at these events has been greatly missed. I was saying to Lady Ashford only last week, Lady Pemberton." His voice was pleasant, but it had a quality of gentle finality in it, the voice of a man who has learned that conversations can be redirected without rudeness if the intention is clear. "I wonder if you might allow me a moment more with your daughter. We were in the middle of something." Lady Pemberton opened her mouth, closed it, and then produced a smile of such concentrated effort that Annalise almost felt sorry for her. "But of course," she said. "Of course. I will, yes." She retreated with considerable dignity, which was an achievement under the circumstances. Annalise looked at the Duke. He had sat back down and was eating his supper with the same unhurried composure as before. "You will have made her evening," Annalise said. "I suspect I may have made several people's evenings," he said, all with a dryness that made her finally, after holding it back for the better part of an hour, smile. It was not a large smile. It was not a performance. It arrived on her face before she had time to decide whether to allow it, and it was entirely genuine, and it changed her face in the way that genuine things do, in the way that all the arranged and careful expressions of an evening cannot, opening something that had been quietly waiting to be opened. He saw it. She watched him see it, and she watched what it did to that composed and careful face, the way it moved through him like the first note of a piece of music, quick and clean and impossible to pretend you had not heard. He looked at her for one long, still moment. Then he looked back at his supper and said, very quietly, almost to himself, "There it is." She did not ask him what he meant. She thought she understood. The dancing had resumed. Annalise stood near the arched doorway between the supper room and the ballroom, watching the couples take their places for a quadrille. The music was bright and lively, the kind of music that made even the most reluctant feet want to move, and the room had the particular energy of an evening that had passed its midpoint and was now moving toward its best hours, when the formality loosened and the enjoyment became less arranged and more actual. She had not spoken to Benedict Ashworth again after supper. He had walked with her back to the ballroom door, said good night with a bow that was correct in every detail, and somehow said considerably more than correctness alone could carry. And then he had been absorbed by the room, by Lord Ashford and two other gentlemen who had been waiting with the patient urgency of people who needed 5 minutes with a duke and had been waiting all evening for the opportunity. She had watched him go, and she had then watched herself watch him go, and told herself several reasonable and sensible things, and felt them make very little difference. Now she stood at the doorway and looked at the quadrille, and thought about cherries and candlelight, and the phrase there, "It is said very quietly to a supper plate by a man who kept his face composed and his words sparse, and his attention from the moment she had entered this building entirely upon her. What, you should not look so pleased with yourself." Genevieve was beside her. She had not heard her coming again, which was beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like her sister's particular talent for appearing at exactly the moment when things were going well. "I am not sure what expression I have," Annalise said mildly. "You have the expression of someone who thinks something has changed." Genevieve positioned herself at Annalise's side, facing the ballroom, so that they stood together like two people watching the same painting and arriving at very different conclusions about it. "He had supper with you?" "He sat at the same table, yes." "He spoke with you for almost 30 minutes. A pause. People noticed. People notice everything at events like this. "They are talking about it," Genevieve said, and beneath the smooth surface of her voice there was something that had not been there before, a tightness, a quality of effort that the smoothness was working hard to cover. "They are saying he sought you out, that he chose your table when he could have sat anywhere. Lady Whitmore's daughter actually left the supper room in tears, which is not your fault, but is a measure of how unexpected this all is." Annalise said nothing. "He will not pursue it," Genevieve said. She turned to look at her sister directly, and her face was very composed, very beautiful. And underneath both of those things, there was something else that Annalise could see clearly, because she had been studying this face her whole life. Something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but occupied the territory between them. Men like that have one conversation at a ball that people remark on, and then they move on. It means nothing. It changes nothing. What, by next week, he will have been introduced to Lady Forsyth's niece, who has just arrived from Edinburgh, and is apparently very handsome, and tonight will be a pleasant memory that you can take out occasionally and look at. "Perhaps," Annalise said. "Not perhaps." Genevieve's voice dropped lower. "I am trying to protect you." It was such a breathtaking thing to say that Annalise turned and looked at her fully. "Are you? You always do this, or you find something small and you make it enormous in your mind, and then when it comes to nothing, you are devastated, and you retreat and you become," she gestured vaguely, "you become that quiet, closed version of yourself that everyone finds difficult to reach." "That is a very detailed account of my inner life," Annalise said. "I was not aware you had been paying such close attention." Genevieve's jaw tightened by a fraction. I am your sister. You told me I looked bald tonight, Annalise said, in front of a mirror before we left the house. You told me directly. You said the word. The name of what had been done hung between them, clear and unadorned. Genevieve did not look away. Her composure was remarkable. It always had been. The ability to hold her expression in place, regardless of the weather inside. I told you the truth. You told me something designed to make me feel small before I walked into a room, Annalise said. Her voice was very steady. She was proud of it, and she also knew that the steadiness was real, not performed, not managed, but coming from somewhere deep and certain in her that the evening had quietly reinforced. There is a difference between truth and a weapon, and you know it, and you have always known it, and you aim very well. Genevieve was quiet for a moment. Then, he's going to hurt you. You do not know that. I know men like him. I know how these things go. You knew him 2 seasons ago, Annalise said. You told him something about Harriet Langdon that sent her away. The effect of this was very small and very visible. A single blink, a barely perceptible shift at the corner of the mouth. Gone in an instant, the composure closing back over it like water over a stone. But Annalise had seen it, and they both knew she had seen it. I do not know what he told you, Genevieve said. He told me enough. A silence stretched between them, longer than the ones before it, and different in quality. The kind of silence that comes after something true has been said, and neither party is entirely ready to continue from it. Then Genevieve did something Annalise had not expected. She looked away. Not dramatically, not with the performance she brought to most things, but quietly, or her gaze moving out to the ballroom and the bright quadrille and the spinning couples, and something in her face shifted into a tiredness that Annalise had not seen before, or perhaps had not been looking for. I did not want to be unkind, she said. It was the quietest thing she had said all evening. I do not always know, when I am being unkind, that I am being unkind. Annalise looked at her sister, at the gold gown and the perfect curls and the jewels at the throat and the tiredness underneath all of it. She thought about how long they had lived in the same house and how rarely they had spoken like this, without the silk wrapping, without the performance of one kind or another. I think, she said carefully, that you do know, and I think it frightens you, which is why you move so quickly past it. Genevieve said nothing. Her jaw was tight. I am not angry with you, Annalise said. And the extraordinary thing was that she meant it, not because she had made peace with everything that had been said and done, but because she was too full of something else tonight, too occupied by a new and startling warmth to give the old hurt the space it usually took up. But I am not going to stand in corners anymore, Genevieve. I am done with corners. Genevieve looked back at her. Her expression was complicated in a way that her expressions rarely were. Usually they were simple and perfectly directed, but this one had several things in it at once, and none of them were entirely comfortable. She opened her mouth, and then the music stopped. Not gradually, not in the natural way a piece of music reaches its ending. It stopped mid-phrase, an awkward and total silence falling over the ballroom like a dropped cloth, and then the hum of conversation, which had continued underneath the music all evening, dropped as well, or until the entire room was in the kind of quiet that only happens when everyone has simultaneously noticed something. Annalise looked toward the center of the ballroom. Benedict Ashworth had walked onto the floor. He had come from the far end of the room, from the direction of the group of gentlemen he had been speaking with, and he had walked with the same unhurried, contained quality he brought to everything, his face composed, but his purpose not announced, but entirely legible to anyone paying attention. He was walking toward her. The room understood this before she did. She could see it in the faces turning, in the ripple of awareness moving through the crowd, in the way people stepped back by inches on either side of his path without being asked, the unconscious deference of a room to a man who carries a certain kind of gravity. He crossed the floor. He stopped in front of her. He was close enough now that she did not need to read his expression from a distance. She could see all of it, the steadiness and the seriousness, and the something underneath both. The something that had been in his face since the supper room, since the cherries, since he had said there, "It is under his breath," and looked at his plate. He did not look at the room. He did not look at Genevieve, who was standing not 3 feet away. He looked at Anelise. "Miss Pemberton," he said. His voice was clear and unhurried, and in the quiet of the room it carried easily. "I believe there is one more dance before the evening ends." She was aware of everything. She was aware of the room full of people watching. She was aware of her mother somewhere in the crowd, probably gripping the arm of whoever was nearest. She was aware of Genevieve beside her, perfectly still, the tiredness on her face replaced by an expression Annalise had never seen there before, while she was aware of the musicians in the gallery above, who were very pointedly not playing. She was aware of all of it, and it mattered to her not at all. She looked at Benedict Ashworth, at the grey eyes and the composed mouth, and the hand he had not yet extended, but was about to. She could feel the intention of it, the certainty of it, like whether she had already learned to read. "I believe you are right," she said. He extended his hand. She took it. The room exhaled. The musicians, taking their cue from whatever was most obvious in the universe at that moment, lifted their instruments and began to play. It was a waltz again, slower than the first, with a quality in the melody that was less bright and more tender, the kind of music that didn't demand anything of the people inside it, but simply held them. He led her to the center of the floor. Not the edge, not a modest, unobtrusive corner. The center, but where the chandeliers were brightest, and the room had the best view, and there was no possible way to be overlooked. She understood that this was intentional. She understood, as his hand settled at her waist, and she placed her own on his shoulder, and they began to move, that he had chosen the center of the floor, the same way he had chosen her table at supper, and her column at the beginning of the evening, deliberately, without apology, without any interest whatsoever in what the room thought of the decision. "You have silenced the entire ballroom," she said quietly, as they turned through the opening bars. "The ballroom will recover," he said. "You walked across a crowded dance floor in the middle of a quadrille. The quadrille has ended. The musicians had not yet. Miss Pemberton." He looked at her, and the something in his face was closer to the surface than it had been all evening, less contained, less careful, and it made her breath catch in a way she decided to simply accept rather than argue with. "I have spent 2 years abroad, telling myself that what I wanted didn't exist, that the real version of a person, the one who stands in their own skin without apology, the one who shares cherries and speaks plainly and smiles like they mean it when they finally smile, that this person was a fiction I had constructed out of hope and impracticality. He guided her through a turn, his hand firm and sure at her waist. I walked into this ballroom tonight prepared to fulfill my obligations and leave early, and then you came through the door. The music was very beautiful. The room was very quiet around the edges of it. I am not a fiction, she said. No, he said. You are not. She looked at him steadily. This man she had known for the span of a single evening. This man who had watched her from across a room and sat down at her table and said, "There it is." And she thought about the fever and the mirror and the thin hair and the word bald said with a smile in a candle-lit bedroom. And she thought about 2 years of recovering and the candle that refused to go out. You should know, she said, that I am not an easy person to know. I am quiet in ways that people find difficult. I form opinions and hold them. I do not perform contentment when I do not feel it. Good, he said. I am also, she continued, keeping her voice level, still recovering from something, not in body, in other ways. I am not finished yet. He looked at her with an expression she could now read clearly, because she had been studying it all evening, and she was a quick study, and what she read in it was not pity and not charity, and not the gracious condescension of a powerful man toward a lesser situation. It was recognition. Neither am I, he said quietly. They danced through the middle passage of the waltz, moving together with an ease that should not have been possible given the shortness of their acquaintance, and Annalise thought that this was what people meant when they said something felt right, not perfect, not finished, not without complication, or but right in the way that honesty is right, in the way that a window opened in a room that needed air is right. She did not know what came next. She knew that the evening would end, and that she would go home in the Pemberton carriage with her mother, who would be incandescent with questions, and her sister, who would be very quiet in a way that was new, and whose quietness Annalise would not yet know how to interpret. She knew that tomorrow morning the drawing rooms of Mayfair would be full of the story of this waltz, this second waltz, this duke who had walked across a floor in a silent room to claim a second dance with the second Pemberton daughter, the one with the thin hair and the ivory gown. She knew that Genevieve's words, the old ones and tonight's ones, would still be there in the morning, because words like that do not vanish. They only get quieter, and you learn to hear other things alongside them. But she also knew this. She knew the feeling of his hand at her waist and the grey eyes and the music holding them both. And she knew that something had begun tonight that was larger than one evening, that had its own weight and its own direction, and that she was not, for the first time in a very long time, standing at the edge of her own life, watching it happen to someone else. She was here. She was present. She was in the center of this bright and watching room, entirely herself. And that, as she thought, as the waltz carried them through the final turn, was enough to begin with. The carriage ride home was exactly what Annalise had expected. Lady Pemberton did not stop talking from the moment the door closed until the moment they turned into their own street. And the talking was not conversation, so much as it was a continuous stream of astonishment delivered at moderate volume. The Duke, the waltz, the supper, the second waltz, the centre of the floor. Had Annalise any idea what people were saying? Did she have any idea who he was? Or had she any idea what this could mean for the family, for the season, for all of them? Annalise looked out the window and let it wash over her like the weather. Genevieve said nothing. This was the strangest part of the journey home. Genevieve, who always had something to say, who could fill any silence with the exact words designed to shape it to her advantage, sat across from Annalise in the dark carriage and looked at her hands, and was quiet. Not the tight, loaded quiet of someone holding something back with great effort. Something softer than that. Something that Annalise, looking at her sister in the brief flicker of passing street lamps, thought might be the beginning of a question that Genevieve did not yet know how to ask. She did not push her. There would be time, or there would not be. Either way, tonight was not the night for it. She pressed her fingers against the cold carriage window and looked at the dark London streets, and let herself, more quietly and privately, and without making too much of it, feel happy. 3 days passed before she heard from him. They were 3 days of considerable household drama. Lady Pemberton received 2 callers on the first morning, who had come, barely disguised, to gather information. She received them with the composure of a woman who has waited 20 years for a moment and intends to extract every drop of satisfaction from it. Lord Fenwick sent flowers to Genevieve, but which caused its own separate storm of discussion, and Annalise sat in the morning room with a book she was not reading and a cup of tea that went cold twice, and thought about grey eyes, and a quiet voice, and cherries on a white plate. On the 3rd day, a letter arrived. It was not a long letter. It was written in a hand that was clean and direct, no flourishes, no elaborate opening, exactly what she would have expected from him. It said that he had thought of little else since the Ashford ball. But it said that he was aware they had known each other for the length of one evening, and that he did not wish to press where he was not wanted. It said that if she would permit it, he would very much like to call on her at her convenience, and that if she would not permit it, he would accept that answer with respect and without argument, though not without disappointment. It was signed by Benedict Ashworth, and beneath the signature, in smaller letters, as though added after the letter was already finished, almost as an afterthought that he had decided at the last moment to include, "I keep thinking about the cherries." Annalise read this final line 3 times. Then she folded the letter carefully, held it in her lap for a moment, and smiled at the window. She wrote back the same afternoon. He called the following Tuesday. Lady Pemberton received him in the front drawing-room with the energy of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mind no fewer than 40 times and was determined to perform it with grace. She offered tea. She offered the good biscuits, not the ones kept for ordinary callers, and she positioned herself in the chair that gave her the best view of both the door and the settee, where Annalise sat with her hands folded, and her expression composed, and her heart doing something entirely undignified beneath her ivory muslin. Benedict Ashworth entered the room, and the room became different, the way rooms always became different when he entered them, quieter and more focused, as though the space itself was paying attention. He greeted Lady Pemberton with perfect courtesy. He sat down. He accepted tea. He made exactly 3 minutes of impeccable small talk, and then he looked at Annalise with the grey eyes, and the almost smile, and all of the rest of it, all of the things she had been carrying around for 3 days, like something precious she was afraid to set down, and said, "Miss Pemberton, how are you?" Not how you do it. Not the formal inquiry that required only a formal answer. How are you? She looked at him. "I am well," she said. "Better, actually, than I have been in some time." Something moved in his face. "I am glad," he said simply. Lady Pemberton watched this exchange with the expression of a woman who is witnessing something she does not entirely understand, but recognizes as significant, which was, Annalise thought, a more accurate understanding of the situation than her mother usually managed. He called again on Thursday, and the following Monday, and twice the week after that. He brought her books, not flowers, which was unusual enough to cause comment among Lady Pemberton's social circle, and which Annalise found she loved completely. He brought a volume of natural history with illustrations of climbing plants that he said had reminded him of the roses in the west garden at Ashford House. He brought a collection of letters written by a traveller in the previous century who had a sharp and funny way of describing people that made Annalise laugh out loud over the breakfast table 3 mornings in a row. They walked in the park. They sat in the drawing room. They talked about everything and nothing, about his time abroad and her years of recovery, about what it felt like to return to a place that had not changed while you had, about books and land, and the particular exhaustion of being managed by people who loved you in the heavy, pressuring way. She told him things she hadn't told anyone, about the fever and the mirror, about the months of looking at her own reflection and not recognizing the person inside it, about the slow, stubborn work of coming back to herself, not to who she had been before. That person was gone, but to someone new who had been built from what the illness had left behind. Someone quieter and more certain and less willing to disappear for other people's comfort. He listened the way he did everything, with complete and unhurried attention, and he did not try to fix it or minimize it or rush past it to something more comfortable. He simply received it, and that, she found, was the rarest and most valuable thing. He told her things in return, about his father, who had been a cold and exacting man who treated the dukedom as the most important character in any room, and his son as a supporting role. About growing up in a house where achievement was expected and warmth was considered a kind of weakness. About the engagement he had almost made and why he had walked away from it, filling in the details he had sketched at the supper table, and about the 2 years abroad where he had slowly, in the unfamiliar air of another country, figured out what he actually wanted as opposed to what he had been trained to want. They were 6 weeks into the season when he asked her to marry him. He did not do it in a ballroom or at a dinner party, or in any of the public settings that such proposals were often arranged around for maximum social effect. He did it in the Pemberton garden on a Tuesday afternoon in early May, when the weather had finally decided to be genuinely warm, and the roses along the back wall were beginning to open. They had been walking the small path between the beds, talking about nothing in particular, when he stopped. She stopped beside him, or he looked at the roses for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I am not going to make a speech," he said. "Good," she said. "I would find a speech alarming. I am going to say one thing. All right?" He turned to face her fully, the grey eyes very clear in the May afternoon light, and said, "You are the most real person I have ever met, and I would like to spend the rest of my life in the company of something real." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the vanity table and the flickering candle. She thought about the word bald aimed at her like something thrown. She thought about standing at a column in a ballroom and deciding, for no reason other than stubbornness, to try the handle of a door she had been told was locked. She thought about cherries on a white plate, and there it is, said quietly to a supper table, and a hand extended across a silent ballroom floor. "Yes," she said, "I would like that too." He took her hand. He held it the way he did everything, without excess, without performance, with a quietness that was not distance, but presence, the kind of presence that does not shout because it does not need to. They stood in the garden for a long time. The roses continued to open around them, pink and cream and gold, entirely unconcerned with anything except the business of being themselves in the warm afternoon air. Lady Pemberton wept when they told her. Happy tears, or the kind she produced in large quantities at any occasion that confirmed her deepest hopes, and she clasped the Duke's hands and said something about Providence that he received with gracious patience, and Annalise received with deep affection, because her mother was, underneath the managing and the calculations, simply a woman who had always been frightened and had always wanted her daughters safe, and this was her version of safe arriving all at once. Or Genevieve was in the drawing-room when they came inside. She rose when she saw their faces, and she understood immediately. She was very quick, always had been. That intelligence applied now to reading something that was not a social maneuver, but a real moment between real people. She looked at Anelise. There was silence. Then Genevieve crossed the room and took both of her sister's hands in hers, and she held them, and she said quietly, so that only Annalise could hear, "I am sorry. For all of it. I have been sorry for longer than I have known how to say it." Annalise looked at her sister's face, at the beauty and the tiredness, and the thing underneath both of them that was, she saw now, not so different from her own experience of growing up in this house, of being shaped by it, and sometimes bent by it, and finding the self that survived it. "I know," she said, and she meant it. She squeezed her sister's hands once, and Genevieve squeezed back, and it was not the resolution of everything, it was not the mending of all the years, but it was a beginning, a real one. And beginnings, Annalise had learned, were enough. They were married in September. The church was full of late summer light, the kind that comes through old stone windows and falls in long golden bars across stone floors, and Annalise walked down the aisle in a gown of warm cream silk with small pearl buttons at the sleeve, because she had always loved those buttons, and this was her day, and she was done, entirely and permanently done, with dressing for other people's comfort. Her father walked beside her, quiet and proud, a man who had never been good with words, but whose hand under hers was steady and sure. Benedict stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him with the expression she had learned to read completely by now, the one that lived just below the composed surface, the one that was all of him, the real version, the one that was not performed for anyone. She reached him. He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night, as though she were the only specific thing in a room full of general impressions. "Hello," he said quietly, just to her, just for a moment before the ceremony began. "Hello," she said back. The minister began to speak. The light moved through the windows. Somewhere behind her, she could hear her mother crying the happy kind of tears again, and she thought she could distinguish Genevieve's presence in the pew, steadier and quieter than she used to be, still beautiful, still sharp, but working, slowly and with visible effort, at being something kinder. She looked at Benedict, and she made her promises to him, and he made his to her. And the words were old words, said in this form for centuries, but inside them Annalise heard her own meaning, which was simply this: I will be real with you. I will not disappear. I will stand in the center of the room, and I will not apologize for being there. He heard it. She could tell by his face. They left the church in September sunshine, and the city was golden around them, and the horses were restless with good energy, and somewhere a bell was ringing, the way bells do when they are rung for happiness, with abandon, with no thought of stopping. The years that followed were not perfect. No years are perfect. There were difficult seasons and disagreements that required both of them to sit with discomfort before resolution arrived, and the ordinary accumulation of a life shared between two people who were both, in their different ways, still learning how to be known. There were losses too, the kind that come to every life, regardless of happiness, and they moved through them together in the way they had agreed to move through everything, with honesty and without performance. But there was also this. There was the house in the country, with the climbing roses along the south wall that Benedict had planted in the first year, because he said he owed her a proper rose garden, and a debt of that kind was not the sort he left unpaid. There were the long evenings in the library with books and firelight and comfortable silence, of the kind that can only exist between people who have stopped needing to fill space with noise. But there were mornings, and there were seasons, and there was the life they built together, unremarkable from the outside, the way all the best things are unremarkable from the outside, and extraordinary from within. There was the night, in their third year, when she sat at her own vanity table in their own room in the country house, and looked in the mirror, and saw her hair, fully grown back now, thick and dark and pinned up with the same pearl-tipped pins she had worn to the Ashford ball, and thought about the woman who had sat at a different vanity table 3 years ago, and listened to a word being used as a weapon. She looked at herself for a long time. Then she looked across the room to where Benedict was reading, his long frame settled in the chair by the window, his face quiet and absorbed and entirely at home. As though he felt her gaze, he looked up, found her in the mirror, smiled. Not the almost smile, or the restrained and careful one he had given her across a ballroom on the night they met. The real one. The one she had been collecting ever since. The one that changed his face completely. The one that was only ever for her. She smiled back, and the candle on the vanity table burned clear and steady and bright, as though it had never once considered going out.